Hey guys, so in the last lesson we talked about the kidney and how the kidney functions. Today we're going to be talking about how that kidney function is regulated. In the last lesson we briefly mentioned something called aldosterone, and we'll be jumping into that, as well as some other hormones that are involved in this process. So on this lesson on regulating kidney function, we're going to be talking about aldosterone, its pathway and effects, also another hormone, ADH, how it functions. We're going to talk about what kind of disorders can result from ADH not functioning properly. We're going to talk about the difference between diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus, as well as what nephritis is and how it affects the nephron. So aldosterone is a hormone. It's produced by the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. So if you remember back to the previous lesson, one of the diagrams we looked at of the excretory system showed the kidneys, and then there was these two little like hats sitting on top of the kidneys. Those are the adrenal glands, and the outside of the adrenal glands are called the adrenal cortex. So aldosterone helps to regulate the sodium ion concentrations in the body, and it does that by affecting the reabsorption of sodium in the kidney. And again, when we're talking about reabsorption, what we mean is absorbing things out of the nephron back into the bloodstream. So that also helps to regulate blood pressure. Aldosterone acts mainly on the nephron. It increases the nephron's permeability to sodium. So more sodium ions leave the nephron and get reabsorbed back into the blood. The release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands is triggered by low blood volume, which can happen if you're like hemorrhaging or like losing a lot of blood. So receptors in the kidney will sense that decrease in blood volume, which will stimulate the release of something called angiotensin, which is then going to stimulate the release of aldosterone. The aldosterone then travels to the kidney, where it will, like I said, affect the permeability of the nephrons. So what's going to happen is the aldosterone goes to the nephron. It's going to cause more ions to move out of the nephron and back into the blood. And then because of osmosis, water is going to go wherever the dissolved stuff is, so wherever the ions are. So as those ions leave the blood, that means that the ions leave the nephron and go into the blood. That means that the water is also going to leave the nephron and be reabsorbed back into the blood. That is how we then increase your blood volume, by increasing the amount of ions and the amount of water that are being reabsorbed from the kidney. That is slightly different from antidiuretic hormone, which is a hormone also called ADH. ADH is made in the brain. Osmoreceptors in the brain detect changes in osmotic pressure in the blood. Osmotic pressure is just essentially like ion concentration, like how many ions are there compared to how much water. A high osmotic pressure is essentially like a high concentration, so like a really concentrated blood, which means you don't have a lot of water compared to how many ions are dissolved there. If you have a low osmotic pressure, that means that there's lots of water, your blood is really dilute. So the osmoreceptors detect the osmotic pressure. If the osmotic pressure gets too high, which can happen if you're like not drinking a lot or if you're sweating a lot, dehydrated, that kind of stuff, those osmoreceptors actually like shrivel up when the osmotic pressure is really high, and that triggers the release of ADH from the brain into the blood, where it then travels to the kidneys. ADH also affects the permeability of nephrons, but it does not cause the nephrons to become more permeable to salt, is what aldosterone does. Instead, the ADH causes the nephrons to be more permeable to water. So more water is going to leave the nephrons and be reabsorbed back into the blood, which means that you're going to pee less because you're absorbing water out of the kidneys. And the pee that you do have is going to be more concentrated. It's also going to result in your blood pressure going up, because as you have more water going into your blood, it's then taking up more space and like pushing out on your blood vessels more, so more blood pressure. And then once the ion concentration or the osmotic pressure goes back to normal, then the osmoreceptors will unshrivel and they will stop stimulating the release of ADH. ADH also causes you to be thirsty, again, because it's just trying to get more water into your blood. You're dehydrated if you need ADH or hitting your nephrons. Okay, diabetes insipidus is a type of diabetes that happens when ADH isn't working properly. So it could be that the ADH isn't being produced in the brain or that it's not being secreted. Or it could be that the ADH is being secreted, but your kidneys aren't responding to the ADH properly. Either way, you're not going to have as much water being reabsorbed out of the kidneys and back into the blood, which means that instead of being able to reabsorb the water out of your urine, the water just stays in your urine, which means that people with diabetes insipidus have to pee all the time, and they pee like a lot all of the time. And it can actually cause dehydration because of how much they urinate. They also often feel thirsty all the time because they're losing all of this water in their urine instead of being able to reabsorb it. So that's actually like one of the big warning signs of diabetes, is being thirsty all the time and then peeing all of the time. Diabetes mellitus, on the other hand, is caused when the pancreas doesn't secrete enough insulin. This is going to cause your blood glucose levels to go up. Normally, glucose in the blood is going to travel through the kidney. It then gets pumped out of the nephron and reabsorbed back into the blood. But if blood glucose levels are too high, the kidney is just not able to reabsorb all of it, and it ends up just staying in your urine, which shouldn't happen if you're healthy. If you're totally healthy, there should be no sugar in your urine. If your blood sugar is too high because it's not being regulated properly, then you end up with some sugar in your urine because your kidney just can't suck all of it out of your urine. That increased concentration of glucose in the urine also causes water to stay in the urine. So in the collecting duct, normally you have water that is leaving the collecting duct because of osmosis, but if you have all this sugar dissolved in your urine, that increased concentration of sugar is actually going to like hold the water there. The water is not going to want to leave because it's going to go wherever the dissolved stuff is, and in this case, the dissolved stuff is the sugar in your urine. So once again, for a completely different reason, people with diabetes mellitus, like diabetes insipidus, pee a lot of really dilute urine. The difference is that with diabetes mellitus, that urine will have glucose in it. With diabetes insipidus, it won't. But both types of diabetes, a symptom of them is peeing a lot of dilute urine, and again, you can't become dehydrated because of that. Nephritis is also an issue that affects the kidneys. It's the name for a whole bunch of different kidney diseases where there's inflammation in the nephron. And if there's too much inflammation in the nephron for an extended period of time, it can actually result in kidney failure. One of the types of nephritis affects the capillary bed in the glomerulus. Essentially what happens is that those capillaries become permeable to large molecules like proteins that would normally stay in the blood, and instead of staying in the blood because they should, they end up moving into the Bowman's capsule. And then because those proteins aren't supposed to be in the nephron, we have no way of reabsorbing them. Our nephron is not built to do that. And so you get all of these like proteins and other large molecules in the urine, which again, all of that dissolved stuff in the urine is going to draw the water in to the collecting duct. So again, lots of dilute urine. Okay, so make sure that you go over the difference between the two different types of diabetes. Again, one is ADH not functioning properly. The other is insulin not functioning properly. Both result in lots of dilute urine, but only diabetes mellitus will have glucose in it. And then I'm also going to just kind of briefly go over a flow chart of the difference between ADH and aldosterone. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of the pathway of aldosterone. So what happens is the person has low blood volume, again, because they're like bleeding out or something. That is going to be detected by receptors in the kidney, which is going to send a signal to the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. The aldosterone goes and affects the nephron tubules in the kidney. It is going to cause them to become more permeable to sodium. So they're going to increase the reabsorption of sodium from the nephron back into the blood. Water is then going to follow because of osmosis. So water also leaves the kidney and goes back into the blood, and all of that works to increase the blood volume. Let's compare that to ADH. So with ADH, it's responding to high osmotic pressure. That is detected by the osmoreceptors in the brain shrinking. So that is detected by the brain, specifically the hypothalamus and then the pituitary. That is going to cause the release of ADH, antidiuretic hormone. The ADH goes to the nephron tubules. It is going to cause them to increase permeability to water, as opposed to sodium. That means that more water is reabsorbed into the blood, which then decreases the osmotic pressure. Okay, and again, all of this is going to result in the person not peeing as much or peeing more concentrated urine. Antidiuretic, a diuretic is something that makes you pee, so antidiuretic is something that stops you from peeing. And obviously you would want that if you were like really dehydrated, which would be the case if you have high osmotic pressure. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.